They accused an innocent man and then tried to drag me into their lie. I didn't know what hit me. I will tell you exactly what happened, but hear every word before you pass judgment. After that, if you're angry with me, so be it. It was the summer of 1958, and the telephone rang at 6:15 in the morning. Now, a phone call that early is never good news. I learned that a long time ago. You pick up the receiver and something in your chest tightens before you even hear a voice on the other end. I had been awake already. Couldn't sleep. The California light was just beginning to press through the curtains, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, reading the newspaper. The headlines that week were full of noise about communists and loyalty oaths and who could be trusted and who could not. It was the kind of atmosphere where a man learned to measure his words carefully, because someone was always listening. The voice on the phone belonged to a man named Henry Corbett. He was a producer at the studio, not one of the big names, but a steady hand. Someone who had been around since the silent days and knew where all the wires were buried. He asked if I could come in early. Said there was a situation that needed handling. I drove through the empty streets with the windows down. The air smelled like eucalyptus and exhaust. When I pulled through the studio gates, there was already a small crowd gathered near the administration building. Not actors, not crew, men in suits, standing in a loose cluster, talking in voices too low to carry. Henry met me at the door. His face looked older than I remembered. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. He took my arm and led me down a corridor I had walked 100 times. But this time, the fluorescent lights seemed harsher. The linoleum floor louder under our shoes. He told me the situation as we walked. A young man who worked in the art department had been named. Not in any official capacity. Not yet. But someone had given his name to a reporter. The accusation was that he had attended a meeting 4 years earlier. A meeting of some organization with a name that sounded radical but had actually been, according to Henry, a discussion group for artists concerned about nuclear war. The young man swore he had gone once, listened for an hour, and never returned. But that did not matter anymore. What mattered was that his name was now attached to a word that could end a career before lunch. His name was Paul Kendrick. He was 26 years old. He had a wife and a baby daughter. He painted backdrops for westerns, and he was good at it. I had seen his work on 3 of my own pictures. He had a way with light, a way of making a painted sky look more real than the actual thing. They wanted me to talk to him. I asked Henry why. Why me? He looked at me with something between hope and exhaustion. He said, "Because you have a voice people listen to. Because you've stood up before and they still want to work with you. Because maybe if you're standing next to him, they'll think twice." I understood what he was asking. He was asking me to put my name beside a man who might be radioactive. To walk into a room where the walls had ears and shake hands with someone the powerful had decided to destroy. It was not a small thing he was asking. The meeting was in a conference room on the 2nd floor. When I opened the door, Paul Kendrick was sitting at the far end of a long table, his hands folded in front of him like a man at prayer. He looked up when I entered, and I saw his eyes were red. He had not slept, maybe not for days. There were 3 other men in the room, studio lawyers. One of them was already talking when I walked in, explaining in that careful, bloodless language lawyers use that the studio's position was delicate, that there were considerations beyond any individual case, that certain associations could not be tolerated in the current climate. Paul Kendrick listened without expression. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply sat there, absorbing the words like a man standing in a cold rain. I took a seat at the table. The lawyers stopped talking. They looked at me with expressions I could not quite read. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. The lead attorney, a man named Fletcher, cleared his throat. He said, "We were not aware you would be joining us this morning, Mr. Peck. This is a personnel matter." I told him I understood. I said I was there as a colleague, as someone who had worked with Paul and knew the quality of his character. Fletcher's eyes narrowed. He said, "With respect, character is not the issue here. The issue is perception. The issue is what certain parties may believe or claim to believe about Mr. Kendrick's associations." I looked at Paul. He had not moved. His hands were still folded, his eyes fixed on the table. I asked Fletcher a question. I asked him if he had any evidence that Paul Kendrick had ever done anything disloyal. Any evidence at all. He hesitated. He said that was not the point. I told him that was exactly the point. The room went quiet. I could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling, the muffled sounds of activity somewhere down the hall. In that silence, I understood something clearly. These men were not evil. They were afraid. They had families, mortgages, careers. They were trying to protect themselves by sacrificing someone smaller, someone who could not fight back. It was the oldest story in the world. I stood up. I walked around the table until I was standing beside Paul Kendrick. I put my hand on his shoulder. I said, "This man has worked on my pictures. He has given this studio years of honest labor. He is a husband and a father, and you are prepared to destroy him because someone whispered a name to a reporter." Fletcher started to speak, but I cut him off. I said, "If you fire this man, you will need to explain it to the press. And when you explain it, you can tell them that Gregory Peck stood in this room and told you it was wrong. You can tell them I called it cowardice, because that is what I will call it, publicly, as many times as anyone asks." The silence that followed was different, heavier. I watched the lawyers exchange glances, watched them recalculate. They were thinking about headlines now. They were thinking about what it would mean to have my name attached to this story. Finally, Fletcher spoke. He said they would need to discuss the matter further. He said no final decisions would be made today. I nodded. I told Paul to go home to his wife. I told him to hold his daughter and not to give up hope. Then I walked out of that room and down the corridor and through the gates and back to my car, where I sat for a long time with my hands on the wheel, not moving. 3 days later, I got another call from Henry. Paul Kendrick had been quietly reassigned, not fired. His name had disappeared from the papers. Someone, somewhere, had decided he was not worth the trouble. It was not a victory. Not really. Paul would carry this with him for the rest of his life. Every job interview, every application, there would be a shadow. The accusation had been made, and even though nothing had been proven, even though no charges were filed, the stain would remain. I saw him one more time. About a month later, he came to the set of a picture I was filming. He waited until the lunch break, then approached me near the craft services table. He looked healthier than he had in that conference room. The color had returned to his face. He did not say much. He thanked me. He said he did not know why I had done what I did, why I had risked my name for someone I barely knew. I told him the truth. I said I did it because it was right, because a man's life is worth more than a whispered accusation, because if good people stay silent while innocent men are destroyed, then the destroyers win. He nodded slowly. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. His daughter, maybe 6 months old by then, sitting in a patch of sunlight on a blanket. On the back he had written 2 words, "Thank you." I kept that photograph for years, not because I needed reminding, but because it helped me remember what the stakes really were. Not careers, not headlines, not the approval of powerful men. The stakes were people, families, the chance to live without fear. I wish I could tell you the story had a happy ending, that Paul Kendrick went on to great success, that his name was cleared, that justice was served. But life is not a screenplay. It does not wrap up neatly in the third act. Paul stayed in the business another decade, then moved his family to a small town in Oregon. He taught art at a community college. He painted landscapes in his spare time. He raised his daughter and grew old with his wife, and never made headlines again. I heard from him once more, in the winter of 1972, a short letter, typed on plain paper. He said he had seen me on television the night before, speaking against the war. He said he was proud to have known me. He said his daughter was in college now, studying to be a teacher. He said some days, when the light was right, he still thought about those backdrops he used to paint, those impossible skies. That was the last I heard from him. I have thought about that morning many times since then. That conference room, those frightened lawyers, the weight of Paul Kendrick's silence. What stays with me is not the confrontation itself. It is the question underneath it, the question every man must answer eventually, usually when he least expects it, when the cost is real, when no one would blame you for looking away. The question is simple. What are you willing to risk for what you believe? I do not pretend to have always answered that question correctly. I have made mistakes. I have stayed silent when I should have spoken. I have spoken when silence would have been wiser. A man lives long enough. He accumulates regrets like stones in his pockets. But that morning, in that room, I answered, the only way I knew how. I stood next to a man who had no power and told the powerful they were wrong. It did not change the world. It did not end the fear that gripped the country. Paul Kendrick's life was still marked by what happened to him, and 1,000 others were not as fortunate as he was. But that photograph stayed on my desk for 30 years. Some days, that is enough. The light through my window now is softer than it used to be. California mornings have a gentleness to them that I did not appreciate when I was young. Back then, I was always rushing somewhere, always thinking about the next scene, the next picture, the next challenge. Now I sit with my coffee and watch the shadows move across the wall, and I think about all the small moments that make up a life. The choices that seem minor at the time but turn out to be the ones that matter most. A telephone call at 6 in the morning, a walk down a corridor, a hand on a young man's shoulder, a sky painted so beautifully it looked more real than the real thing. That is the story. There is no moral at the end, no lesson wrapped up with a bow. Just a man who faced a choice and made it, and another man who survived because someone stood beside him when it counted. I suppose, if there is anything to say, it is this. The moments that define us rarely announce themselves. They come quietly, disguised as ordinary days, and when they arrive, we discover who we really are. Not who we hope to be, not who we tell ourselves we are, who we really are. The telephone rings. The door opens. A man sits at a table, with his hands folded, waiting to learn his fate. And you decide, you always decide,